The year was 1852. In the heart of Bengal, the air didn't just carry the scent of jasmine and expensive scotch. It carried the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating stench of fermented indigo. High atop the hill, the governor's mansion glowed like a wicked diamond against the pitch-black night of the jungle. Inside, the floorboards were polished to a mirror sheen, ready to reflect the silk gowns of the British elite. But outside, in the mud and the shadows, the men who bled blue were watching. Tonight, the governor's daughter would wear a dress dyed in the very color of their agony. And before the final candle flickered out, she would do the unthinkable. She would reach into the darkness and pull a ghost onto the dance floor. This isn't just a story of a ball, it's a chronicle of the night the Untouchable stepped into the light and the empire began to tremble. The visual essence of the 1852 Governor's Ball relies entirely on the violent collision between two incompatible worlds, the shimmering gold of the empire and the bruised indigo of the enslaved. In the ballroom, the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers creates an artificial sun, casting a warm, honeyed glow over the ivory shoulders of the elite. This golden radiance is designed to mask the rot of the colonial machine, making the guests feel as though they are gods, residing in a sanctuary of pure light and refinement. Every surface is polished to a blinding sheen, reflecting the brass buttons and medals of men who have never known the sting of the sun. Yet, this brilliance is a fragile veneer, a thin layer of expensive wax stretched over a dark and hollow reality. The gold does not illuminate the truth. It serves as a blinding agent to keep the horrors of the outside world at bay. Beneath this glittering surface lies the second world, defined by a color that felt more like a disease than a pigment, the sickly, haunting blue of the indigo vats. This was not the vibrant azure of a summer sky, but a deep, suffocating sapphire that looked like the skin of a drowned man. To the British, this blue was the color of profit and high-fashion textiles, but to the riots, it was a brand of permanent servitude. The indigo was so potent that it seeped into the very pores of the workers, staining their hands, arms, and chests until they looked like walking shadows. In the pitch-black fields surrounding the mansion, these men moved like ghosts, their blue-stained bodies blending into the darkness until only the whites of their eyes remained visible. This blue was a mark of the untouchable, a physical manifestation of a social death sentence that kept them tethered to the mud. The visual storytelling of the video must emphasize that these two colors, the gold and the blue, were never meant to occupy the same frame or breathe the same air. In the colonial imagination, the ballroom was a fortress of purity where the stain of the native world could never hope to penetrate or belong. The gold represented the civilization the British claimed to bring, while the blue represented the savagery they claimed to manage, creating a stark visual apartheid. When the governor's daughter moved through the crowd, her white silk dress acted as a blank canvas, a symbol of the untainted status of the ruling class. The camera should focus on the overwhelming whiteness of the lace, which stood as a silent provocation to the darkness waiting just beyond the threshold. This purity was the ultimate pride of the governor, a visual proof of his absolute control over a land he viewed as inherently dirty. However, the horror of the narrative begins to seep in when these two visual worlds finally collide at the center of the dance floor. When Kalu enters, the warm gold of the room seems to recoil from the cold, midnight blue of his skin, creating a jarring and uncomfortable visual friction. The contrast is not merely aesthetic, it is an act of visual violence that shatters the carefully curated illusion of the governor's grand and expensive evening. As Kalu stands amidst the finery, his blue-stained limbs look like ink dropped into a glass of clear water, spreading a darkness that cannot be undone. The guests, draped in gold and silver, look like porcelain dolls that might break if they even glance at the raw, stained reality of the man before them. The visual tension is found in the way the blue refuses to be brightened by the chandeliers, remaining a stubborn, light-absorbing void. The climax of this visual keynote occurs when the white silk of Clara's gown finally makes contact with the blue-stained hands of the untouchable slave. This is the moment the two worlds merge in a way that is both beautiful and terrifying, as the sapphire pigment begins to bleed onto the fabric. Each movement of the dance leaves a smeared trail of blue on the ivory dress, a permanent record of the contamination that the governor feared most. The camera must linger on this transfer of color, showing how the untouchable mark has now been claimed by the highest symbol of colonial purity. By the end of the scene, the dress is no longer white. It is a map of the rebellion, stained with the very color of the suffering that paid for the ball. The gold of the room is defeated by the blue of the earth, proving that no wall is thick enough to hide the stains of an empire. The sensory landscape of the governor's mansion was a carefully constructed fortress of vanity, designed to project an image of absolute and unshakable British authority. Every architectural detail, from the towering Doric columns to the imported marble floors, served as a silent manifesto of the governor's belief in his own inherent superiority. Within these walls, the air was chilled by heavy punkahs swung by unseen hands, ensuring that the sweltering heat of the Bengal jungle never touched the skin of the ruling class. The governor moved through these spaces with a predatory grace, viewing his domain not as a home, but as a stage for his ego. To him, the estate was a beacon of light in a dark land, a physical representation of the order he imposed upon what he considered a chaotic and unruly population. This pride was his armor, a thick layer of arrogance that blinded him to the growing resentment simmering just beyond the perimeter of his manicured gardens. Every guest at the 1852 Winter Ball was a pawn in the governor's grand game of social and political posturing, meant to witness the height of his power. The ballroom was filled with the rhythmic click of polished boots and the soft rustle of expensive silks, sounds that drowned out the cries from the nearby indigo fields. Archibald Sterling stood at the center of this whirlpool of wealth, his chest adorned with medals that caught the light like the eyes of a cold and hungry beast. He demanded perfection from his servants, treating them as mere extensions of the furniture, expected to be invisible until a glass needed refilling or a coat needed brushing. This dehumanization was the foundation of his vanity, as he truly believed that the people he exploited were incapable of the very emotions he felt. The ball was not a celebration of community, but a ritual of exclusion, intended to remind everyone, both guest and servant, exactly where they stood in his rigid hierarchy. The vanity of the governor extended to the very food and drink served, all of which was imported at a cost that could have fed 1,000 starving villages. Tables groaned under the weight of silver platters piled high with meats and fruits that were alien to the soil of India, emphasizing a disconnect from the land itself. Each bottle of champagne opened was a celebratory toast to the extraction of wealth, a liquid gold born from the blue sweat of the indigo workers. Sterling took immense pride in the fact that he could recreate a London salon in the middle of a tropical wilderness, viewing this feat as a triumph of the British will. He walked among the elite with a smug satisfaction, relishing the envious glances of his peers who marveled at his ability to command such opulence. To the governor, the ball was proof that he had conquered nature and humanity alike, bending both to his insatiable desire for prestige and recognition. Hidden behind this facade of grandeur was a deep-seated fear that his fortress of vanity was far more vulnerable than he dared to admit to himself. The governor's obsession with control was a reaction to the vastness of the land he could not truly understand, and the millions of people he could never truly own. He insisted on the most rigid protocols and the most extravagant displays of wealth to drown out the nagging realization that he was an intruder on this ancient soil. Every candle lit was an attempt to push back a darkness that felt increasingly heavy and sentient, as if the jungle itself were waiting for a moment of weakness. His pride was a brittle thing, dependent on the continued silence and submission of those he stepped upon to reach his high and lonely pedestal. He looked upon his daughter Clara as the ultimate piece of property in his collection, a pure reflection of his bloodline that he expected to remain untainted by the surrounding reality. Ultimately, the governor's mansion was a hollow shell, a monument to a man who mistook the fear he inspired for the respect he believed he was owed. He did not see the servants as individuals with memories or spirits, but as cogs in a machine designed to maintain his comfort and feed his vanity. This blind spot was his greatest failure, as he never imagined that the very people he treated as shadows were recording every insult and every act of cruelty. The ball of 1852 was intended to be his magnum opus, a night that would be whispered about in the halls of Parliament as a testament to his leadership. Instead, it became the site of his ultimate humiliation, where the walls of his vanity finally cracked under the pressure of a truth he could no longer ignore. His pride had built a world of glass, beautiful and transparent, but destined to shatter the moment the untouchable world finally reached out to touch him back. Clara Sterling was never the obedient porcelain doll her father imagined, for her spirit was forged in the quiet observation of the world beyond the mansion's whitewashed walls. While other ladies of her station busied themselves with the trivialities of lace and gossip, Clara spent her afternoons on the high balcony, staring into the emerald abyss of the Bengal forest. She watched the lines of indigo workers trudging toward the vats, their bodies bent under the weight of an empire that saw them only as tools. To her, they were not the units of labor her father discussed over dinner, but living, breathing tragedies draped in a haunting, permanent blue. She felt a growing, suffocating kinship with them, realizing that her own life was merely a more gilded form of confinement and social performance. Her rebellion did not begin with a shout, but with a silent, simmering refusal to look away from the suffering that built her world. The young indigo worker Kalu became the focal point of her quiet defiance, standing as a living testament to the humanity her father sought to erase. Clara watched from above as he endured the heat and the lash, noting the way he held his head with a dignity that no amount of colonial brutality could break. There was a magnetic, somber gravity to his movements that made the bustling British officers in the drawing room seem like hollow, fluttering insects in comparison. She began to despise the finery of her own existence, seeing the silk of her gloves as a barrier between her and the raw, painful reality of the earth. In Kalu's stained skin, she saw the true face of the land, a bruised and beautiful strength that made her father's rigid laws feel like nothing more than paper walls. She didn't just pity him. She envied his authenticity, for he was the only thing in her sight that wasn't a curated lie. Her heart became a vault of dangerous empathy, where she hoarded the sights and sounds of the plantation that were meant to be ignored by a lady of her rank. She would listen to the distant, rhythmic chanting of the workers at dusk, finding a profound and ancient sorrow in their voices that spoke to her own trapped soul. Every time her father boasted of his control over the savages, Clara felt a sharp internal recoil, as if the words themselves were a poison that threatened to numb her. She began to realize that her father's civilization was nothing more than a carefully maintained silence, built on the backs of those who were forbidden to speak. Her rebellion was a slow-growing vine, wrapping itself around the pillars of her morality until she could no longer support the weight of the governor's grand illusion. She waited for a moment of rupture, a chance to prove that the blood in her veins was not as cold as the marble she walked upon. The night of the winter ball was intended to be her debut into a world of high society marriages and political alliances, but to Clara it felt like a funeral for her soul. As the servants tightened the corset of her gown, she felt as though they were sealing her into a tomb of white silk and social expectations. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger, a ghost of a girl who was being prepared to be traded like a piece of indigo for a higher rank. The laughter from the ballroom below sounded like the clinking of chains, reminding her that she was expected to smile while the world outside bled for her father's pride. She knew that the Untouchables were lurking in the shadows of the garden, forbidden from the light, yet she felt more connected to them than to the guests. In that moment of intense isolation, she made a silent vow to break the glass, even if the shards cut her to the bone. When the heavy doors finally creaked open and Kalu stepped into the golden light, Clara did not feel the shock or horror that froze the rest of the room. Instead, she felt a wild, soaring sense of relief, as if the reality she had been watching from her balcony had finally come to claim its place. She saw the fear in her father's eyes and the disgust on the faces of the officers, and it only fueled the fire of her long-buried indignation. Her decision to move toward him was not an act of romance, but a deliberate, vengeful strike against the hierarchy that had held her captive. By reaching for the untouchable, she was finally touching the truth, choosing the bruised blue of the oppressed over the hollow gold of the oppressor. As she took his hand, she wasn't just starting a dance, she was initiating the collapse of her father's world, one blue-stained step at a time. The atmosphere within the grand hall was a fever dream of opulence, where the frantic tempo of a Viennese waltz masked the mounting tension of the night. The orchestra played with a desperate, soaring energy, their bows moving in a synchronized blur to keep the silence of the surrounding jungle at bay. Suddenly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the chamber, not from the sky, but from the heavy, iron-studded oak doors being forced wide. The music did not fade away. It died a sudden, violent death, leaving a vacuum of sound that made the guests' ears ring. In that hollow silence, the rhythmic wet thud of bare, mud-caked feet hitting the marble floor sounded like the beating of a vengeful heart. The light of the chandeliers seemed to dim, unable to penetrate the thick, heavy air that Kalu brought in from the darkness. Kalu stood in the threshold, a living shadow that refused to be cast out, his very presence a desecration of the governor's sacred space. He did not skulk or bow his head in the expected manner of a servant. He stood with a terrifying, statuesque stillness that demanded to be seen. His skin was a deep, bruised indigo, a permanent stain that looked like the hide of a celestial creature rather than the flesh of a man. The contrast was a physical assault on the senses, his raw and ragged appearance cutting through the sea of silk and gold lace. Every guest stood frozen, their champagne flutes arrested halfway to their lips, as the untouchable reality of the fields finally invaded their sanctuary. The horror was not in any weapon he carried, but in the simple, undeniable fact of his existence within their world of lies. The silence that gripped the room was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that felt as though it might crush the lungs of every aristocrat present. You could hear the sputtering of the candles and the ragged breathing of the governor, who looked as though he were watching a ghost rise from a grave. To the elite, Kalu's entrance was more than an intrusion. It was a cosmic error, a breakdown of the divine order they believed governed the universe. The untouchable was never supposed to cross the threshold, yet here he was, bringing the stench of the vats into the scent of the jasmine. No one moved to strike him, for to touch him would be to acknowledge his humanity, and so they simply stared in a paralyzed, collective shock. This was the moment the illusion of colonial safety vanished, replaced by the chilling realization that the walls were not high enough. The governor's face transformed from a mask of aristocratic boredom into a twisted map of rage and primal, soul-deep fear. He gripped the hilt of his ceremonial sword, his knuckles turning a ghostly white, yet his legs remained rooted to the spot by a sudden, inexplicable dread. He looked at Kalu and did not see a man, but the embodiment of every crime he had committed to maintain his high and lonely position. The air between them crackled with the energy of 1,000 floggings and a decade of stolen labor, a debt that was finally being called in. In the eyes of the untouchable slave, the governor saw not a plea for mercy, but a cold and unwavering judgment that bypassed all his titles. The power dynamic of the entire British Empire seemed to tilt on its axis in that one long minute of wordless confrontation. Around the room, the women clutched their pearls and retreated into the shadows of the pillars, as if the indigo stain on Kalu's skin were a contagious plague. The soldiers, usually so quick to display their bravado, found themselves fumbling with their scabbards, their polished bravery wilting under the weight of Kalu's steady, silent gaze. There was a sensory horror in the way the mud from his feet began to seep into the pristine white grout of the marble floor, a slow-moving invasion of the earth. It was a visual reminder that no matter how much gold was piled high, the land would always find a way to reclaim its own in the end. The ballroom had become a theater of the macabre, where the audience was forced to watch as their nightmare stepped off the stage and into the crowd. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a deafening precision, marking the final seconds of the world as the governor had always known it. Clara moved with a deliberate, haunting, slow-motion grace that seemed to defy the panicked physics of the suffocating ballroom. Her white silk skirts hissed against the marble like a warning, cutting through the stagnant air of the frozen, elite crowd. As she approached Kalu, the gasps of the British officers sounded like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone in the dark. She did not look at her father's reddening face or the trembling hands of the ladies clutching their fans in terror. Her eyes were locked onto the deep, bruised indigo of Kalu's skin, seeing the maps of agony etched into his flesh. With a hand that did not shake, she reached into the void of the untouchable and claimed it as her own. When her white-gloved hand finally rested on Kalu's stained shoulder, the silence in the mansion became something physical and heavy. The touch was a blasphemy against every law of the empire, a chemical reaction that threatened to burn the house down. Kalu's hand, dark and rough from the corrosive vats, closed around her waist with a strength that was both gentle and terrifying. He did not lead her as a servant leads a mistress, but as a man reclaiming a stolen piece of the world's dignity. The orchestra, sensing a shift in the very atmosphere of the room, began to play a slow, discordant melody. It was a rhythm born of the plantation drums, a sound that crawled up from the mud and into the gold. As they began to spin, the pristine ivory of Clara's gown began to drink the indigo dye from Kalu's permanent blue-stained skin. Every rotation left a smear of sapphire across her midriff, a visual record of the stain transferring from the slave to the master. To the onlookers, it looked like a white rose being dipped slowly into a vat of dark, poisonous ink in real time. The governor tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as he watched his daughter become a canvas for the rebellion. This was not a dance of love or romance, but a ritual of public, devastating social desecration and truth. The blue was no longer a mark of shame. It was becoming a badge of honor on her silk. The guests retreated into the shadows of the columns, watching the pair move like a storm cloud swirling in a clear golden sky. The rhythmic thud of Kalu's bare feet against the marble provided a grounding primal counterpoint to the screeching violins above them. Every person in that room felt the floorboards vibrate with a truth they had spent their entire lives trying to bury deep. Clara's face remained a mask of cold, vengeful serenity, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the dying, sputtering chandelier candles. She felt the heat radiating from Kalu's body, a living fire that made the bumbling officers in the room look like ghosts. They were dancing on the grave of the old world, and every step was a nail in its coffin. By the time the music reached its final crashing crescendo, the lower half of Clara's dress was a chaotic masterpiece of indigo. The governor's pride lay in ruins at his feet, shattered by the simple, undeniable touch of a man he called a beast. The blue dye had claimed the white silk, proving that the wall between the untouchable and the elite was nothing but a lie. As they came to a halt, the indigo-stained girl and the blue-skinned man stood as the only real things in a room of wax. The horror of the dance was its permanence, for the stain on the silk and the soul could never be washed. The ball had ended, and the long, dark night of the Empire's reckoning had finally, at last, truly begun. The silence that followed the final note of the orchestra was more deafening than the riot that eventually tore through the mansion's grand halls. In the days that followed, the governor's fortress of vanity became a tomb of reputation, as the story of the blue-stained silk spread like a fever. Archibald Sterling was recalled to England in disgrace, his authority evaporated by the simple, defiant touch of a man he had deemed a ghost. The mansion was abandoned to the humidity and the vines, left to rot as a monument to a night where the hierarchy finally snapped. It stood as a hollow shell, its windows like empty eyes watching the indigo fields that would eventually rise up in flame. The Untouchable had not just danced. He had dismantled the psychological armor of an empire in a single sapphire-stained evening. The legend of Kalu and Clara became a whispered anthem in the dark corners of the riot's huts, fueling the fire of the 1859 Indigo Rebellion. Workers who had once bowed their heads now looked at their blue-stained hands not as a mark of shame, but as a weapon of identity. The story transformed from a scandal into a mythic prophecy, suggesting that the blood of the land would eventually drown the white silk of the masters. It was said that the blue dye never truly left the marble floors of the ballroom, no matter how hard the remaining servants were forced to scrub. The physical stain was gone, but the spectral memory of the dance remained, a haunting reminder that power is as fragile as a thread of lace. Colonial history was rewritten that night, shifting from a narrative of absolute control to one of inevitable creeping decay. Today, the ruins of the governor's estate are whispered to be inhabited by the echoes of that discordant waltz and the scent of fermented indigo. Locals tell of a girl in a tattered, blue-smeared gown who can be seen spinning alone on the overgrown terrace during the monsoon rains. They say the jungle has reclaimed the stone, but the air still carries the chilling weight of the silence that fell when the doors were forced open. No one dares to walk the halls at midnight, for fear of meeting the gaze of the man who refused to stay invisible. The horror of the legend lies in its truth, that the exploited never truly disappear. They only wait for the music to stop. The ball remains a ghostly fixture in the landscape, a cautionary tale about the high cost of vanity and the power of the untouchable. Ultimately, the events of 1852 serve as a grim prologue to the eventual collapse of British rule in the East, a first crack in the foundation. The untouchable slave Kalu vanished into the wild, but his spirit remained in every act of sabotage and every defiant stare across the vats. The dance was the first time the colonizers were forced to see the humanity they had tried so hard to industrialize and erase. It proved that even the most rigid structures of oppression can be shattered by a single moment of radical, fearless empathy and shared blood. The indigo dye, once a symbol of forced labor, became the ink with which the first pages of freedom were written in the soil. As the mansion crumbles into the mud, the story of the blue-stained ghost remains, reminding the world that some stains are eternal.